The moment I saw my property marker floating down the creek like a cheap toy somebody got tired of playing with, I knew two things. First, somebody had been on my land again. Second, whoever it was had stopped caring whether I noticed. What I didn't know was that this stupid little piece of plastic drifting through the water was about to unravel an entire neighborhood and expose something a whole lot uglier than simple trespassing. My name is Ethan Parker, and about 18 months ago, I bought a small place outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just a modest house tucked behind a stand of oak trees with enough land around it that I couldn't see my neighbors unless I wanted to. After spending almost 15 years working construction and living in crowded subdivisions, that kind of privacy felt like winning the lottery. The biggest selling point was the creek. It wasn't large enough to impress anybody, but it cut through the back of my property in a lazy curve that made the whole place feel peaceful. Some evenings I'd sit out there with a folding chair and a cup of coffee, watching the water move while pretending my phone didn't exist. That creek was mine, not in some vague sense either. The deed specifically included the section running from an old stone culvert to a giant sycamore tree about 60 yards downstream. Private property, private access, end of discussion, or at least that's what I thought. Right next to my land sat a neighborhood called Willow Creek Commons. You know the type. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, holiday decorations that somehow appeared on the same day every year. And of course, an HOA. Now, technically my property wasn't part of that neighborhood. It sat just outside the development boundary. That was actually one of the reasons I bought it. No HOA fees, no approval forms, no committee deciding what color my front door should be. It sounded perfect. Then I met Sharon Whitmore. The first time she came onto my property, I was unloading boxes for my truck. She walked right up my driveway, carrying a clipboard like she was conducting a military inspection. "Welcome to the community," she said with a smile that somehow felt more like a warning. I thanked her. 30 seconds later, she was criticizing my storage shed. I remember staring at her thinking, "Lady, I haven't even unpacked my coffee maker yet." She introduced herself as president of the Willow Creek Commons Homeowners Association and proceeded to explain several community expectations. The problem was, none of those expectations had anything to do with me. At first, I figured she was just one of those people who treated authority like a hobby. Everybody knows someone like that. You smile, you nod, you move on. But Sharon didn't move on. Over the next couple months, I started finding notes on my door. Suggestions about landscaping. Reminders about property appearance. Warnings about maintaining community standards. Then came the emails. Then the letters. Then the threats of fines. Every time I ignored one, another appeared. It got so ridiculous that one Saturday morning, I printed my property survey, highlighted every boundary line with a bright red marker, and handed it directly to her. I still remember standing at the edge of my driveway while she looked down at the paperwork. "Sharon," I said calmly, "my property isn't part of your HOA. You don't have any authority here." She barely glanced at the survey. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile somebody gives when they've already decided they're right. "We'll see about that," she said. Then she turned around and walked away. For some reason, those 4 words stuck with me. "We'll see about that." At the time, I thought she was just being stubborn. I had no idea she meant it. A few weeks later, spring started rolling in. The mornings were still cold enough for a jacket, but you could feel summer waiting around the corner. I grabbed my coffee one morning and headed down toward the creek, planning to spend 20 quiet minutes before work. That's when I saw the marker floating downstream. The stake had been ripped out of the ground. The sign was bobbing in the current. And somewhere farther ahead, around the bend near the sycamore tree, I could hear laughter. Then music. Then voices. I followed the sound. The closer I got, the more confused I became. Because what I found wasn't one trespasser. It wasn't even a couple. It was something far worse. And standing right in the middle of it all was Sharon Whitmore. Looking completely at home on land she had absolutely no right to be standing on. Standing right in the middle of it all was Sharon Whitmore. Looking completely at home on land she had absolutely no right to be standing on. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. There she was sitting in a folding chair near the creek bank, sunglasses on, drink in one hand, fishing rod in the other. Around her were 3 other people I recognized from Willow Creek Commons. One guy was digging through a cooler. Another was setting up a portable speaker. Somebody had even brought lawn chairs. They weren't acting like guests. They were acting like owners. I stopped about 20 feet away and cleared my throat. The music kept playing. Nobody moved. So I did it again, louder this time. That got their attention. Sharon turned around and smiled. Not surprised. Not embarrassed. Just annoyed that I'd interrupted her morning. "Ethan," she said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I looked around. At the chairs. The fishing poles. The cooler. Then back at her. "You're on my property." One of the men laughed. "Come on," he said. "It's just a creek." I pointed toward the water. "Yeah, my creek." Sharon took a sip from her cup and crossed one leg over the other. "Actually," she said, "the board voted on this last month." I blinked. "You voted on what?" She gestured around the area. "This section has been designated as a shared community recreation space." For a moment, my brain genuinely refused to process what she just said. "You voted to take somebody else's property?" "No," she replied confidently. "We voted to improve access for neighborhood residents." I remember staring at her, thinking there was no way she actually believed this. But she did. That was the scary part. She really believed her authority extended beyond reality itself. I could have argued. I could have yelled. Instead, I asked one question. "How long have you been coming down here?" A brief hesitation crossed her face. "A few weeks." That answer changed everything. Because a few weeks meant this wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was organized, planned, deliberate. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked away. Behind me, I could hear one of them laughing. Somebody made a joke about property lines. They thought they'd won. What they didn't know was that 6 months earlier I'd installed security cameras around the back portion of the property. At the time, it seemed excessive. Now it felt like the smartest thing I'd ever done. The moment I got home, I opened my laptop and pulled up the footage. The first few clips weren't surprising. People walking through the trees, cutting across my land, fishing along the creek. Then I started going further back, and that's when my stomach dropped. Because what I was seeing wasn't trespassing. It was a takeover. 3 weeks earlier, Sharon and several board members had arrived carrying tools. They spent nearly an hour clearing brush along the creek bank. 2 days later, they came back with wheelbarrows. Then came the clip that made me physically sit forward in my chair. A man named Greg Dawson, one of Sharon's closest supporters in the HOA, fired up a chainsaw. I watched him walk toward a young dogwood tree growing near the bend in the creek. "My tree." He looked toward Sharon. She nodded. Then he started cutting. The sound wasn't audible through the footage, but I didn't need audio. I knew exactly what was happening. 5 minutes later, the tree was on the ground. 10 minutes after that, they had dragged the trunk into position and turned it into a makeshift bench. I just sat there staring at the screen. People talk about property damage like it's just money. It's not. That tree had been there long before I bought the place. I'd watched it bloom during spring, watched birds nest in it. It belonged there, and they cut it down because they wanted somewhere to sit. I wish I could tell you that was the worst thing on the footage. It wasn't. A week later, they returned carrying bags of gravel. Truckload after truckload. They built a walking path straight through my property. Not around it. Through it. Like they were developing a public park. Then came the families. Every weekend, more people showed up. Children running through the creek. Teenagers climbing trees. Adults drinking near the water. One little boy slipped on a wet rock and disappeared underwater for a second. Just 1 second. But my heart nearly stopped. When he resurfaced laughing, the adults barely looked up. That's when something clicked in my head. If that kid got hurt, if somebody drowned, if someone broke a leg, the lawsuit would land on me. Not Sharon, not the HOA, me, because legally it was still my property. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The anger was there, but underneath it was something else. Disbelief. How does somebody convince themselves they can simply absorb another person's land into their neighborhood because they think it would be nice? The answer, I realized, was simple. Nobody had ever stopped them before. That afternoon, I started saving everything. Video clips, screenshots, timestamps, property records. I created folders and backups. Then I called the one person I trusted to tell me the truth. Her name was Rachel Lawson. We'd met years earlier when she handled a contractor dispute for my brother. Since then, she'd become one of the most respected real estate attorneys in the county. When she answered, I skipped the small talk. "Rachel," I said, "I think I have a problem." An hour later, she had copies of everything. The videos, the survey, the HOA letters, the emails, all of it. That evening, she called me back. There was a long pause before she spoke. Ethan, promise me something. What? Do not confront them again. That got my attention. Why? Because this is worse than you think. I felt my stomach tighten. Worse how? They knowingly entered private property. They altered private property. They destroyed private property. And based on what I'm seeing, they've been falsely representing legal authority over land they don't control. I sat down. You're serious. Very. Then her voice became even calmer. The way lawyers sound when they're already 10 steps ahead. Save everything. We're going to handle this correctly. The next call I made was to the sheriff's department. 2 days later, Deputy Mark Reynolds was standing in my kitchen watching the footage. He didn't say much at first. Just watched. Clip after clip. Timestamp after timestamp. Then the chainsaw video appeared. He folded his arms. That's your tree. Yep. He nodded slowly. Not a good sign. A few minutes later, the footage of the gravel path came up. Then the children. Then the gatherings. Then the rope swing somebody had attached to a branch over the creek. By the time the final clip ended, Reynolds exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. Well, he said quietly, this got complicated. I looked at him. What happens now? He glanced toward the screen one last time. Then back at me. We're way past warnings. Those 5 words hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly this wasn't just some neighborhood disagreement anymore. This was becoming something real. Something official. Something that wasn't going away. And none of us knew yet that the videos from my cameras were about to trigger a chain reaction that would eventually bring down far more than Sharon Whitmore's little empire. And none of us knew yet that the videos from my cameras were about to trigger a chain reaction that would eventually bring down far more than Sharon Whitmore's little empire. The following week moved faster than anything I'd experienced in years. Rachel filed the civil claims. The sheriff's office opened a formal investigation. And for the first time since moving there, I started hearing stories from people who had been keeping their mouths shut for a very long time. It started with my neighbor, Carl, retired electrician, quiet guy, the kind of person who only speaks when he has something worth saying. One afternoon, he walked over while I was repairing a fence post. You know, he said, leaning against the gate, you're not the first person Sharon's pushed around. That conversation turned into 2 hours. Then another neighbor called. Then another. Then another. Before long, Rachel and I had a growing collection of emails, letters, screenshots, notices, and complaints from people all over Willow Creek Commons. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Sharon hadn't built authority. She'd manufactured it. People paid fines because they assumed she was right. People followed rules because arguing felt exhausting. Most never checked whether those rules were even enforceable. They just went along with it. Until now. The real turning point came during an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't invited. Honestly, I wouldn't have gone anyway. Rachel attended on my behalf. Later that night, she called me. I could hear amusement in her voice. How bad was it? I asked. She laughed. Ethan, I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've never seen confidence disappear that fast. Apparently, Sharon opened the meeting pretending everything was normal. Community concerns. Maintenance updates. Budget discussion. The usual routine. Then Rachel distributed copies of the survey maps, legal filings, photographs, and investigation reports. The room went silent. Not angry silent. The kind of silent that happens when people suddenly realize they've been told a very different story from the truth. According to Rachel, Sharon tried arguing that the HOA acted in the best interests of the neighborhood. Rachel's response was simple. You don't acquire ownership of private property by voting for it. That ended the discussion. Within days, board members started resigning. Then county officials got involved. Then things became truly interesting. During a routine review, an inspector discovered that part of the HOA's community garden extended beyond its approved boundaries. Not by much, but enough. Further inspections uncovered additional violations, permit issues, land use violations, drainage modifications. Then environmental officials became interested in the gravel pathway near my creek. Turns out altering runoff patterns in that area required approvals nobody had obtained. One investigation led to another, then another, and eventually investigators started reviewing financial records. That's where the real damage appeared. Expenses that couldn't be verified, payments approved without documentation, vendor invoices linked to relatives of board members. Money that seemed to disappear and reappear in very convenient places. Sharon's name appeared repeatedly. So did several of her closest allies. Suddenly my trespassing complaint wasn't the biggest story anymore. Not even close. One morning, just after sunrise, 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled into Willow Creek Commons. Word spread through the neighborhood before breakfast. By lunch, almost everybody knew. Sharon Whitmore had been arrested. No dramatic scene. No television cameras. No high-speed chase. Just quiet professionalism. The same way real consequences usually arrive. Several others followed over the next few weeks as investigators completed their work. Watching it unfold felt strange. People assume moments like that feel satisfying. Honestly, they don't. Mostly it felt sad, because none of this had to happen. At any point, Sharon could have simply respected a property line. Instead, she convinced herself that power and ownership are the same thing. They aren't. They never will be. A few months later, the civil case finally concluded. The judge ruled in my favor. Compensation for the damaged tree. Compensation for restoration costs. Legal fees. But the most important part wasn't financial. The court ordered the HOA to publicly clarify the limits of its authority and acknowledge that my property had never been under its jurisdiction. In plain English, they had to admit they were wrong. Officially, in writing. For me, that mattered more than any check. Not long after that, residents voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. No restructuring, no rebranding, no fresh start, just finished. Done. The organization disappeared almost as quickly as it had once dominated the neighborhood. Over time, things settled down. The arguments faded. The rumors stopped. People started acting like neighbors again. As for me, I went back to the creek. I planted a new dogwood tree near the spot where the old one had stood. I removed the gravel, restored the bank, built a simple wooden bench overlooking the water. Nothing fancy, just enough to sit and enjoy the quiet. One evening near sunset, I found myself sitting there alone. The creek moved lazily through the fading light. The new tree swayed gently in the breeze. For the first time in a very long while, nobody was telling me what I could do with my own property. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was demanding anything. Just silence. The good kind. The earned kind. I thought that was the end of the story. I really did. Then, 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from the county. According to the notice, my property had been flagged for reassessment because of an unreported structure located near the creek. Attached was a blurry aerial photograph. I stared at that picture for several minutes. Because the structure in the image wasn't mine, I hadn't built anything. In fact, after comparing landmarks and tree positions, I became pretty sure the structure wasn't even on my property. Which raises an interesting question. If it wasn't mine, then why was the county associating it with my land? And more importantly, who built it? The next evening, I found myself standing beside the creek again, holding that letter while staring toward the tree line beyond the far bank. The sun was setting. The water was moving. Everything looked peaceful. But something about that photograph bothered me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was experience. Or maybe after everything that happened, I'd learned that problems rarely disappear completely. Sometimes they just change shape. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were standing where I was, holding that letter after everything that happened, would you let it go and finally enjoy the peace you'd fought for? Or would you start digging again, even if it meant uncovering another fight waiting on the other side? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because honestly, if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's that property lines are easy to see on a map. The real boundaries people cross are usually the ones they convince themselves don't exist.